Well, thanks. I appreciate it. There was a little discussion about having Charlie Dent and Jim Jordan and another member here to see if they could reconcile their differences and find some ways to work together. Actually, I've been trying to help with that, despite my sometimes reputation for being a little crusty. So, the president wanted to talk about $1 trillion of infrastructure investment, well, yeah, Hillary talked about 500 billion, so then not to get done, he said $1 trillion. Now they're a little short on specifics, and I'll get into that in a moment, but I decided to be helpful, and I put together a package of 3 bills on which I have, the first one is a no-brainer anywhere except in Washington, D.C., which is to spend the harbor maintenance tax on harbor maintenance. Every time you buy an imported good, there's a minuscule ad valorem tax on the value of that good as it comes through the port. And since the Reagan era, that money has purportedly been set aside for harbor maintenance. Unfortunately, every year Congress sees fit to divert almost half the money into a theoretical trust fund which never gets spent. The balance is closing in on $10 billion in that trust fund. Yet we have, in our 59 largest harbors, we have on a daily basis an average of 35% of capacity because of a lack of dredging. And then of course we have jetties failing in many places, and we're looking at a whole new generation of ships that are going to even more depths. So I introduced a bill that would actually make the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund into a real trust fund, like the Highway Trust Fund, and say that those monies can only be spent on harbor maintenance, and actually, begin to spend those monies. Over 10 years, we could invest about $30 billion if we spent the full amount of the tax coming in and the accumulated theoretical balance in the theoretical trust fund somewhere in the bowels of the Treasury. So I introduced that bill with Mike Kelly from Pennsylvania, Freedom Caucus member, because I'm trying to demonstrate that we can put these things together. Second bill is for airports. The president has, repeatedly talked about what dumps our airports are. Now, he probably hasn't been in the airports in Oregon because ours are pretty good, but he's probably been in, Newark or LaGuardia or I don't know where he's been or whatever FBOs he's using for his jets, but they are. And there is, again, a huge unfunded need. A lot of airports are bonded out. The woman who runs Denver, for instance, they need additional gates to extend their terminals. They've entered into an incredibly innovative P3 to rebuild the main terminal, but for the outer terminals, she doesn't have the funds, and the airlines, strangely enough, aren't interested in having more gates. It has something, I think, to do with worrying about competition. So the only way she can get there is if she could raise her passenger facility charge and bond it, and then have a cash flow. So I introduced a bill, again, with a Freedom Caucus member, Mr. Massey from Kentucky, to lift the cap on the passenger facility charge and allow the airports to deal with their $34 billion of unfunded needs. Now the airlines will tell you that this is horrible, because if Denver raises the passenger facility charge $1, no one will ever fly again. However, if they charge you $50 for your bag, you'll say, oh, thank you very much, I really like that. Oh, and $25 to sit on the aisle? Oh, I love it. This is like, so again, I think they're worried about new capacity, new entrants. So I've introduced that bill. Now those two are, relatively minor. The biggest need we have is for surface transportation. Over $100 billion backlog to bring existing transit up to a state of good repair, and anybody who lives in this city knows how bad Metro was. We're actually killing people because it was so bad, and the emergency repairs that have been done, let alone to talk about building out new capacity in the system to help people get out of their cars. So $100 billion just to bring it up to a state of good repair. National highway system, 40% of the pavement has failed to the point where you have to rebuild the roadbed, not just resurface it. And on bridges, we got 140,000 bridges that need substantial repair or replacement. So, I've tried all through the Obama administration. I was one of very few Democrats to vote against the so-called Recovery Act. idiot Larry Summers turned it into a tax cut bill instead of an infrastructure investment bill. I tried to get Jim Oberstar to vote the committee against it. And Jim said, oh no, they promised me the next thing will be a big infrastructure package. Well, I said to Jim, God rest his soul, that you've been here a lot longer than me, but in DC the next thing never happens in my experience, and it didn't. They pulled the plug. And I tried numerous things throughout the Obama administration to get more revenues, and was never quite successful, except in his last budget, his lame duck budget, he put in a kind of a strange version of my proposal for a barrel tax to fund infrastructure. That was real helpful in his last lame duck budget. So I decided, look, there's a lot of aversion around here to taxes or whatever, but how do you do something that's laughable, that is so minuscule that anybody could put their name on it? So I'm proposing very simply to index the existing gas and diesel taxes to construction cost inflation and fleet fuel economy. And the projections are, if we did that, and oh, by the way, I capped the annual increase. If we ever have runaway inflation, the annual increase can never be more than 1.5 cents a gallon. But if we did that, we could borrow $500 billion. We'd tranche it. We would borrow the money over 15 years, and it would be all 30-year bonds, and it would all be paid for by that little increment on the gas and the diesel tax. Now, I didn't get any Freedom Caucus members on that, but I did get Lou Barletta on that bill. So there's 3 bipartisan bills, and I've sent them down to the president and talked to DJ Gribbon and others down there about this package. The funny story is someone who I know told me that when Elaine Chao heard that I had these 3 bills, 2 of them with Freedom Caucus members, she said, oh, I can't wait till I go home and tell Mitch about that. DeFazio and the Freedom Caucus. Well, I'm trying to show them there is a way to work together on this stuff. But we've got to put substance there. And just in closing, I'm worried about diversions. We heard some last week or the week before, they started talking about, oh, well, the feds will only put up $200 billion, and then we're going to get $800 billion out of the cities and counties and states. Well, 24 states have already raised their gas tax in the last 3 years. My state just did it. We were the 24th. And, so the states are doing their part, but they need the federal partnership. This isn't a 50-state system. It's a national system, and some of the needs are national bottlenecks. They're huge. We need the substantial federal investment, and if we get diverted into, I know there's someone here from the Australian Embassy which is trying to sell us asset recycling, something they did for 2 years in Australia. They don't do it anymore, but they think it would be great for us to do it because their investment companies want to buy infrastructure here. We studied this very comprehensively a few years ago on the committee. Bipartisan consensus after a year of hearings, real hearings and meetings, is that privatization P3s could deal with somewhere between 9 and 12% of our infrastructure needs. That's it. So for the other 88 to 91%, we need a partnership of the states, the feds, local governments, and then yes, there are some projects, ironically mostly in blue areas of the country, where P3s will pencil out. And you can make money on privatizing infrastructure, but most places you can't, particularly not in the red states. So that's where I'm at, and I'm actually meeting with DJ today. He's coming down. Turns out he likes craft beer. So in my only leadership role as co-chair of the Craft Brewers Caucus, I'm going to ply him with beer and hopefully make some progress on these issues. Thanks very much.
He used the term crusty to describe himself. I would use the word clear. Peter's always very clear on where he is on the issue. So, but let me start off by saying, first of all, thanks to the Ripon Society and the Franklin Center for bringing together a bipartisan group, because I think Peter makes the point very well that we got to figure out ways to come together, not just on infrastructure, but a lot of different areas. I believe that our committee over the last 4.5 years or so has been able to come together in a bipartisan way to get a number of bills done, complicated bills, highway bill, a couple of WERDA bills, and now we're working on FEMA. We did a Coast Guard bill this year. I guess we did, time seems to fly. We're working on a FEMA bill to tweak it to make sure that the folks in Texas and the Southeast and Florida make sure that the relief is coming to them faster and streamlined so they can get themselves back on their feet as fast as possible. So again, we're working on those areas as we move forward. Of course, one of my highest priorities, which has been a point of partisanship on the committee, is to make sure we pass an FAA bill. I don't think there's any disagreement that the FAA needs to be reformed. It's just how we go about it, and it's obviously a high priority. And just to let you know, the schedule for that is we were going to have it on the floor this week, but hurricanes shortened our week, and we've got some other things on the floor. We intend to come back after the recess and do an extension. We're working with our counterparts on the committee to try to figure out what's the best timeline for an extension, and then in early October move to the floor with our FAA bill that again we don't see eye to eye on specifically how we move forward. But that put aside, Peter makes some very good points, and in the spirit of bipartisanship, I think he's right on 2 out of his 3 points he puts forward. The first, the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, I absolutely agree with Peter. There's $1.8 billion, and it's growing every year. The user fee that goes into that fund, Peter's absolutely right. They spend about half of it, and then we put it in this lockbox that's out there, and I think $10 billion is the number. And I certainly support that, although Peter put it on the floor on our last WARDA bill, but there's a rule in the House which of course can be overcome, but it's very difficult, and that is the budget rules, and we couldn't move forward with that. So I'm committed, and I've already spoken to the White House about taking that fund and make sure it's a user fee. It's in a trust fund, and when you have a user fee, we trust that the money is going to be spent on what its intended purposes, and we have a tremendous amount of need in our ports and harbors. So again, I agree with Peter on that one. I'll move to his the second point on the PFCs. I disagree with him to the extent that, you know, the traveling public, he says the airlines, it's the traveling public that pays those fees. And every time we get into a little bit of a pinch for some money, we want to just slap on just a little fee onto the traveling public to let them pay for things that don't even relate to airports and to aviation. We divert those dollars. So I think it's fair to say the traveling public and the airlines and those stakeholders that are involved want to see true reform. And I think after you get true reform, then we can talk about these other things. But just to slap on another fee, another tax on them, I just disagree with until we see real reform is what we're trying to do. So I disagree with him on that point. But the third point that he makes is we have got to figure out how to make the federal investment into our infrastructure. And I agree with Peter that there is a federal role, and it's significant. It's a national transportation system. Diverting it back to the states or putting it on the states, what you're going to get is a patchwork of investment. You know, one state's going to invest, another state won't. And Peter's famous for putting up his Kansas and Oklahoma. Kansas built the interstate to the Oklahoma line in the 50s, and they stopped because Oklahoma didn't have the money. There is a federal role. We have to figure out how to do it. And I am open to look at any way, shape, or form on moving forward on how do we do that. From Peter's ideas, I know Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma's got an idea on I guess it's a carbon tax. Look at that. And of course, the president has not taken the gas tax off the table. I think that's something that we ought to be looking across the board. $1 trillion is not going to come from the federal government. But we've got to look at different ways. Peter's right. I may disagree with him on his percentages, P3s. I think they can do a bit more than that. But again, I'm open to look at every way, shape, or form. And as he mentioned, over 20 states, my state of Pennsylvania has dealt with it. They did something a little different, but they increased the fee at the pump is gone up in Pennsylvania. They got about $3 billion more to spend over a period of time. So again, states that have done that, Republican states, Pennsylvania did it with a Republican governor, a Republican House, and a Republican Senate, and nobody lost their election when they dealt with that, because the American people understand the need to invest in infrastructure. So again, I'm open to all that. Now it's great we have 3 countries here, Australia, Canada, and Japan, that are very interested in their infrastructure, and they're also talking to us about what they've been doing. Canada's done a great job of doing public-private partnerships and other forms to invest in their infrastructure. You've got the Japanese are here talking about high-speed rail and investing in high-speed rail in America. I think they're very involved down in Texas in that project down there. And Australia has done infrastructure spending. And again, Peter and I disagree on this. I don't think it's the silver bullet that solves all our problems. But once again, I'm open to look at anything. And their asset recycling is something we ought to take a look at. Because everywhere in the world, that a nation that's advanced, they're looking at these and they're actually doing these types of things. And so I think it's going to take all different kinds of programs and thinking outside the box. Is how do we invest in infrastructure? And as Peter said, sending it back to the states, I don't think that's the devolution. It's pretty much dead. I think there's some people still talking about it, but again, I don't think that the federal government ought to give up its role in making sure that we have the best interstate highway system, the transportation system in the world, and we don't today because we have not invested. So again, there's a lot of ground for Peter and I to work together on, and we're working closely with the White House. I heard he was going with DJ. I sent a text to DJ and said, make sure you have good beer, because the couple times I didn't have good beer, I caught hell for it.
I'm providing beer.
Okay, that's good. That's always a safe bet. But it's good and I encourage the White House to sit down and talk with our counterparts on the other side of the aisle, because we are not going to do an infrastructure bill if we don't, with our Democratic partners, and I agree with them, unless we pay for it. Putting up more debt, there's a way to go about it. There's different ideas out there. We ought to be looking at everything and bringing our Democratic colleagues on board, because infrastructure is not a Republican and a Democrat issue. It's always been an American issue. Everybody wants good roads. Everybody wants safe airports and flying safely. The ports and our harbors or inland waterway system. All of it has to work together. And so again, this is an issue that I believe if we go about it and the White House goes about it in the right way, we'll be able to do a big infrastructure bill and everybody will walk away kind of happy. Not completely happy. But with that, let me end there and we can open for questions, I guess, Jim. So thank you very much.